Speaking of the elements of value, there was a great cartoon in the New Yorker showing this guy standing in front of his vinyl setup, his turntable, his stack of records. He said, the thing that really drew me to it, the things that really drew me to vinyl were the inconvenience and the expense. I just love that. Yeah. The thing that drew me to film is all the bad chemicals and the inconvenience of it.
I saw that you're actually started with social sciences and anthropology. And I also saw one of your interviews where you were very interested in the psychology. So tell me a little bit about sort of what got you into Boston University anthropology and Stanford University after that. So,
Yeah.
So what's the origin story of our Mr. Eric?
So I'll give you the full perspective on my years on this earth. I actually was born in a small town in Nebraska, raised in cattle country in the north central part of the state, and I had a pretty unremarkable childhood. I was very interested in science. I made a one transistor radio when I was a kid. You should note that the current iPhone has 16 billion transistors in it, which is gives you a sense of what I've seen in my lifetime. I ended up going to college at Stanford University, met my wife there, and she was an art history major. It turned out I had intended to study math. I've always been interested in mathematics and still read some mathematics, but I realized that the world was bigger and more complicated than the field of mathematics, and I really wanted to learn more about people in the world. I ended up majoring in anthropology, mostly because my advisor that was assigned to me, one of the first Black professors at Stanford, he and I hit it off, and I liked him and I liked his courses, and I ended up studying anthropology. And basically, Paul, I was pretty aimless at the end of my time in college, and I followed my then girlfriend back to Boston, and we got married the next year. I decided to go to graduate school. I applied to a number of schools, and I went to Boston University because they had a particular interest in historical studies, and at that point I was interested in geography, which tends to be quite a historical field. I was interested in things like central place theory and location theory, which turns out to be more like economics than anthropology. But to make a long story short, I actually got interested in a wide range of social scientific fields. And I chose a topic for my dissertation that had to do with essentially what was going on around the Industrial Revolution in Europe. And I picked a case in Ireland having to do with something called proto-industrialization, which was the industrialization of the rural countryside through handicrafts, and in particular in Ireland, the linen spinning industry, which supported the weaving industry in the Belfast area. That turned out to be the biggest export business in Europe at the time. And I was interested, the theory of proto-industrialization was just kind of getting going then. It was the early 70s. And I looked at the Irish case and applied a lot of statistics to very good data that was being gathered in Ireland at the time. Probably the first great census in the world was the 1841 census of Ireland. So I did a lot of work on that. And eventually, I finished my PhD. I published 2 articles out of that work in referee journals, Journal of Economic History and the Economic History Review. I met a lot of wonderful people, including Joel Mokyr, who's a professor of economics at Northwestern, one of the great economists in the world. And he sort of took me under his wing. And eventually I decided I really wanted to do research for a living as opposed to be a professor. I really didn't like teaching all that much. Maybe that relates to what I told you earlier, that I'm not much of a talker. But I really do like research. I ended up in a small consulting firm in Boston, which eventually became Mercer Management Consulting, and it's now called Oliver Wyman. And I basically was doing market research, but I realized that there was a whole world of more sophisticated analytics out there. And with some friends and some people I hired, we created really the first marketing science analytical unit in the consulting industry at Mercer. So I'll pause there for the moment. That's a brief sketch of how I got into consulting. By the way, I got my first job by applying to a blind ad in the Boston Globe.
What?
Yeah, it's like, nobody gets a job that way. But in fact, it turned out that that ad, my applying to it, changed my life. It allowed me to have a career that was unlike anything I ever imagined. So really a stroke of luck and randomness.
I am so curious what the copy of that ad was that got you intrigued and hooked into applying.
Well, it basically said a small market research firm is looking for a technical director. You have to know about statistics and blah, blah, blah. But they didn't say what the firm was. And so I knew that they weren't just advertising it for, equal opportunity purposes. They were looking for someone. Turned out I was their second choice. Their first choice turned it down. So too bad for that person, but it was great. And when I went in for the interview, my boss, or it ended up being my boss, now very good friend, 42 years later, 3 years later, he was talking to his bookie, placing bets on horses in New York as I sat next to his office. And I thought, I think this guy's an operator. I think I want to work for him. So anyway, it turned out we had a fabulous relationship, and it was so essentially I've simplified everything a little bit here, but essentially I've worked for 2 firms, Mercer and Bain, although both evolved tremendously during the years that I've been there. So,
right. I had just like one sort of very tiny observation, because I'm just looking at your LinkedIn, is you were also at Lippincott, which is like a branding agency, I think.
Yeah. So yes, it is. It was the first corporate identity branding firm in the United States. It was founded in the 40s. The reason I got involved with Lippincott, it's a long story, Paul, but when I was at a firm in Boston that became Mercer Management Consulting, we had been acquired by Marsh & McLennan, which is a big insurance brokerage. They, for some reason, bought Lippincott, very small, profitable firm at the time. They bought it back in the 80s. And they never knew what to do with it, or how to grow it, or, and what they didn't even know what it was about, really. And so I was running the marketing practice at Mercer, and then the chairman of the Mercer Group asked me, Eric, will you take Lippincott under your wing and help transform it into a growing business? And I said, well, I'd be happy to do that, but I think we're going to need a new management team. I happen to be friends with a fellow named Ken Roberts, who had been with a firm called Lefkowitz, and then a firm called Anspach in Portugal. And I called him up immediately and I said, Ken, I want you to come over and be head of Lippincott. And it took him about 6 months to do that because he had commitments and so forth. But he eventually came over and totally turned the firm around into a growth engine, with high profitability, and really helped create what Lippincott is today. So I had really very little to do with the transformation other than knowing the person to hire. But that's how I got mixed up. But I was interested in brands. You mentioned psychology a few minutes ago. I've always been interested in behavioral economics. I've read a lot in that field. And we, in the early 80s, started to apply to marketing problems some science called discrete choice analysis, which was developed by a psychologist and economist at Berkeley back in the 70s. It applied choice theory to consumer problems, and they developed this technique called discrete choice analysis, which is basically an approach to having consumers make simulated choices as those choices change, and as maybe competitor choices come into the choice sets. And by analyzing the choice that consumers are making, you can begin to understand what product features, what prices, what brands are driving their decisions. We did our first choice model in roughly 1983, just as the telecom industry was beginning to deregulate. And we sold hundreds of studies to the telco industry over the next 10 years, 10 or 15 years. We're still using that technique at Bain today. Most executives still don't know about the science. It's just unbelievable. But because of that, we began to notice that, you can change product features and you can change prices in these models, and you can understand the effect on demand. But what you can't change is what the meaning that a brand has to consumers. And so the models actually quantify the effect of a brand, all else being equal, on consumer choice. And just to give you an example of where we did this, when I joined Bain, I led a group of partners through a one-day course on consumer insights. We gathered in New York City. People came in from around the world, and one of the people on the team at Bain when I arrived was a fellow who was a student of Jordan Louviere, who I had hired at Mercer to teach us about discrete choice models. Anyway, Jason Lee, who was a student, ended up at Bain. I had Jason do some work to demonstrate discrete choice models. We did a study, Bain sponsored it, on consumers' choices of MP3 players. So we looked at, this was before the iPhone, by the way. So we looked at iPods. There was a Sony product. There was, I can't even remember the other brands, which is a clue as to what we found. But the choice model showed that if you held the storage capacity constant, the price constant, kind of the other features constant, Apple had 3 to 4x choice advantage. In other words, 3 or 4 times as many consumers were choosing Apple as anything else. Now, if you raise and lower the prices to equalize share, it turned out Apple could charge, I forget the number, $140 more or something than Sony. And Apple's market cap had just crossed Sony's that year. That's why we chose this case. But it just blew the partners' minds. And I guarantee you that if we had all taken that data and said, okay, I'm going to invest a third of my money in Apple stock, we would all be long retired, right? So it shows the power of discrete choice models. It shows the power of brands. And it kind of just blew the minds of Bain partners. They'd never seen that kind of analysis before. And Jason, he manipulated the simulator in real time on a projector so they could see the Apple effect. We then replicated that in 2012, I believe, on the iPhone. And Apple still had that advantage, and they still have it today. So what Apple realized is that they can take their brand equity and their product excellence in price terms. Samsung was relegated to a different strategy, which is they'll take whatever advantage they have in share terms. So there are probably more Android products out there in the world than Apple. But Apple's one of the most valuable corporations in the world. And so, we had, the point of all this is we realized when we were growing Lippincott within Mercer, we realized that there's some powerful tools that can be brought to brand strategy. Not just the usual surveys or, focus groups and so forth. So that's kind of, I got interested in brands because of the economic effect that brands have. There's also a classic case of a joint venture between Toyota and GM back in the 80s. They built a plant in California called NUMMI. They produced one car, which then went into 2 brands, Toyota Corolla and Geo Prism. The Toyota sold 200,000 units. This will be approximate, at $300 more than GM, which sold 70,000 units. So 70,000 versus 200,000. That's a rare case of having essentially kind of a choice model in market, where you had the same product, but 2 different brands, and one just massively outperformed the others. So that that was a fun period because we were trying to bring some science to the field of branding. That's how I got mixed up with Lippincott.
Okay, so you said a whole bunch of stuff, but the first thing I want to sort of get your perspective on, and this is something that I've sort of heard off and on in sort of different contexts and situations, is that for the average person, big data, big numbers, it's so hard for them to comprehend those big numbers. So comprehending and understanding the data, that's one. 2, understanding differences between like median versus average, and so because the interpretation of that data is so different. And since you've sort of lived and breathed it, so what makes the person who does kind of what you do different from the average person? And how do you sort of think about like statistics, like large numbers? And so what's that DNA that's different to you, unique to you?
I had a very good experience in graduate school. I don't need to go into details, but I took some very good courses in statistics and data analysis just when I needed those skills. And so I was doing my dissertation research. I was gathering a lot of data. I was hand plotting scatter diagrams. This was before PCs, long before PCs. I had a four-function calculator that cost me about $300. But I had a professor take me under his wing and took my data set it up in a computer, and an IBM mainframe 360 at Boston University. I spent 6 weeks with using SPSS, which is a statistical package, I think now owned by IBM. And I just had the time of my life because I was testing all the hypotheses that I had developed over almost 2 years to do my dissertation. And by the way, I now have that same data set on my personal computer at home. And I use a freeware statistical package I think it's called JASP. And I can now do all of those analyses in about 45 minutes. It took me 6 weeks because you had punch cards. You take the punch cards to the window, and your job would fail because you messed up something in the code. And you have to, so it was like a little. But now I can do it in 40 minutes. And by the way, the findings are all identical to what they were in 1975. So it was just a really amazing educational experience to be able to learn at the same time I could practice on my own data set. And by the way, I don't think of myself as a big data guy. I think you can have small data sets that are incredibly revealing. And, the most big data these days is produced by, the engines of business and all of the data exhaust that comes out of business. And I'm a big believer in distinguishing between data that is coming out of history, which most of big data is, and data that is coming out of experiments or in-market trials that represents new data. And as an example of this, just think of what happened during COVID. COVID basically ruined every marketing mix model in the world because consumer behavior changed 100% overnight, practically speaking. And all of that history was just kind of wiped out and new history was created. So COVID was actually an amazing experiment in economic behavior. So anyway, the reason I bring that up is we do a lot of what's called test and learn or test for results at Bain. We do a lot of in-market experiments. Some of that is done over social media. Some uses the same science as discrete choice models, except we're putting things into market instead of into surveys. And so I'm a really big believer in experimentation, not just deriving insights from history. Because a great example is we did some work for a burger chain years ago here at Bain, and we applied some pricing tools to their sales record. Well, it turned out 40% of their SKUs, 40% of their items had no variation in price in the previous 2 years. So you can't find out about price elasticity if you don't have any variance. So, and that's why a firm called APT that I was quite familiar with was acquired by MasterCard. The APT does retail experiments where they're injecting variance into retail systems so you can pick up changes in demand as a function of price or product features or whatever. So the other thing that gets me excited is the concept of heterogeneity is really important. It's been a big topic in economics now for about 20 years. And basically, heterogeneity says there's just not one economic man there or person. People are different. They value different things and they behave in different ways. So that's what market segmentation is all about, and uncovering different types of people with different kinds of needs. It's a very important principle, and that's one case where frankly marketers were well ahead of economists um, in realizing that. And so that's been a great development. It's something that we do a lot of work in. To come back to your question, I think the real reason is I just kind of love this stuff, uh, and and I like thinking about it, and there are lots of theoretical issues involved. There's and computers have just enabled types of analyses that are mind blowing today. So I mean, it's I'm up there in years, and I just can't imagine 20 years after I'm dead what the world is going to have at its fingertips. I hope it's mostly good. It may not be, but computers, technology, analytics, it's just incredible. And I have lived through. Yeah, I lived through the history of rock and roll, but I also lived through the history of data analysis pretty much because of computers, right?
Based on sort of what you were saying earlier, is in a nutshell, so you're sort of obsessed and passionate about numbers and data and this stuff. And often with now AI coming out and sort of these large language models and a whole bunch of stuff happening now, a lot of people are like, you should know how to code, or you should be this or that. I would sort of go on the offense and say, hey, you know what? I think there's huge or immense potential and value in understanding and being able to understand large numbers data, or even how to use the tools to interpret that data. So what are number one, where do you maybe now see the role of sort of what you do moving forward? One, and I think you sort of touched on that. But two is how somebody who's not exposed to this could get into it, or the other sort of branch to this sort of whole idea being, what is like the most common and obvious mistakes people make when it comes to this stuff?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of getting into a career in data analytics, whatever you want to call it, I think studying it at school is the place to start, and I would start with fundamental statistics, a real grounding in true data analysis, meaning understanding what data is, understanding what frequency distributions are, understanding what descriptive statistics are, understanding the principles of sampling and the differences in different types of errors, and then all the various techniques like regression and unmixing models and all of that sort of thing. Before you get into AI and machine learning, one of the problems with machine learning is you often don't know how to interpret the findings because the computer is kind of taking your mind away, and you don't know what to do with it. So I think a real grounding in the basics, and something like regression alone, people have spent their lives studying it. It's once you do a bunch of different regressions on data, you realize that regression is really tricky. And and here's the other thing I would say, just to your question's a good one. What are the things that go wrong? I think one of the things that goes wrong often is people have no theory of what's going on in the world. And without a theory of what's going on in the world, it may be that you're finding spurious correlations. I'm sure you've visited those websites that show the the number of deaths in the United States correlates very highly with the sale of ice cream or something. I don't know, but um, you got to have some theory of what's going on to guide uh, the analysis and the interpretation. And that's what I think, a background in social science can really help, because you begin, or economic, any field really, but any scientific field, but you got to have a theory of what's going on. I mean, Einstein, even 100 years ago, 120 years ago, people are still confirming his theories with facts. They're still finding facts and concluding it. Yep, he was right about this too. Now, not everything, but theory is really important, and a lot of people don't realize that.
Right. I think that's also something we hear constantly in like our consulting space, or or in advertising or marketing specifically, is you should have a point of view, even that if you, it's like a strong opinion held loosely. You start with a point of view, an opinion, whether that's to do with your brand positioning, that this is sort of and or who that audience is that you want to talk to.
Yeah.
So sorry, I want to go back to one other thing that you were talking, one example that you took earlier, and I'm really curious about that one example where you were looking at the MP3 players and you were sort of looking at the price. By the way, a whole bunch of stuff that you're talking about, like regression, and I have no idea what any of that means.
That's okay. That's okay.
And we'll go deeper into the ones that I mean, of course, for the audience listening, there's Google, so you can Google some of these things. But some of them, I'm gonna ask Eric to explain a little bit more in a more richer way. But for the sake of sanity and time and everything, I'm not going to cover everything. So for the data nerds and people who want to get into like statistics and stuff, for them, they can go and explore some of this stuff. Now, so you were talking about those MP3 players, and I remember another conversation, which, and of course, we're going to get into the whole the
elements of value, yeah,
piece. But I'm really curious how much attractiveness played into that. And I don't even know if at that point you had even had an initial impression of the pyramid. And we'll get into the sort of the origin and backstory of that too. But I wonder, in those earlier phase when you were looking at MP3s, how much attractiveness sort of played.
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul. And one of the limitations of discrete choice models is that they work really well for things like that you can describe, like product features, like prices, and so how many gigabytes the device will store, etc. But it works less well for things like how beautiful the product is. And if you showed an iPod, let's say, or a Zen, I think it was called Zen,
or Zune.
Maybe it was, maybe it's Zune, something, yeah, or a Sony MP3 player. That design is wrapped up with the brand, so it's hard to separate out the brand from kind of the design component. So I strongly suspected that the iPod was just better designed than all of those other products that look like kind of poor quality Sony Walkman that were smaller or something like that, And Steve Jobs, his real genius was design and paying attention to the details. He really wasn't a computer designer. They took all the icons and all that kind of stuff from Xerox anyway, right? Um, that was the origin of those ideas. But he was a design person, and design was the turnaround of Apple. Um, and I think Android phones look nice, but they're not an Apple. It's so. And now I'm totally into the Apple, the iPhone ecosystem. So I don't want to go through the hassles of changing. But I mean, I think Samsung and and Pixel and others have done great jobs designing their products. Um, but Apple did it first, and they continue to push on that in a big way. So attractiveness was definitely at work there. We just couldn't quantify it at that point, Paul.
Right. So I think this sort of connects the dots with something else that you said somewhere else. So if I was, and let me get this a shot. So, and this, I'm making an assumption also, is maybe back then the models that we had didn't factor in empathy, emotion. I wonder if that's changed. That's the first part. And then the second part to that is, I think you took an example of like an appliance brand, and they were sort of priced at like $40 and they were really focusing on the features, whereas these other players in the market were like really high priced, and you sort of worked with them. And I think when I heard that example, and I think about the Apple example that you just talked about, is that of course there is that price, the features, how much storage does it have, but what does it make you feel? What does it say about you? That signaling value, like Rory Sutherland, I follow that person quite a bit. I don't know if you do. And then the other piece to that is, like, if you look at like a Dyson example, a Dyson is just a vacuum. But that attractiveness, in addition to all the features, is what really like seals a deal. I don't know. So I'm sorry, I just went sort of all over the place.
No, I know exactly what you're getting at. So I'm just looking up something really quickly here on the internet. I can't remember a brand name that I want to mention, but so I think Dyson is a great example of they charge. I don't know. They've got a hair dryer that costs like $200 or something. And
500.
whatever it is. It's just I don't even use a hair dryer, but it's a good example. The classic example in my experience is rice cookers are used all over Asia. Every household that has electricity practically has a rice cooker, and you can get a pretty good rice cooker for $25 or $40. The better ones are $100. Well, a few years ago in Japan, a couple high-end players came in. One was called Balmuda, and the other is a name I can't remember, but I'll get it to you. And these rice cookers were selling for more like $1,200, and they were really beautiful. The lids were machined so that they closed within 10,000 of an inch or something. They you can now buy them in the U.S. And the Panasonic and the other rice cooker manufacturers in Japan were just totally blindsided. Like, why are people paying $1,200? And the reason was that these were beautiful machines, and they gave you bragging rights, and you wanted to have it, front and center in your kitchen so everybody saw it, and it made you feel better. Didn't cook the rice probably any better, but but it was also more, in some ways, more versatile. You could some of the models you could control the temperature within 1 degree from some enormous range from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to, boiling or something. So, and by the way, those companies tended to make very traditional Japanese kind of steel pots and stuff like that, and they took that route, making traditional pots look more functional, look beautiful, whereas the electronics manufacturers, you can't tell if a rice cooker is like a CD player or whether it's a microwave, right? They're just kind of bad looking product. So so this whole issue of emotional response and defining who you want to be, how you want people to see you. It's been in play ever since probably the Middle Ages, Paul, or maybe even before. The in the 18th century, pottery manufacturers discovered this, perfume manufacturers discovered this. So it's been around that consumers want to use products not only to use them but to define who they are, to show social status or other. So it's been a phenomenon, and this is what I began to think about as I developed the elements of value. And it was specifically because there are certain things that discrete choice models, despite their power and accuracy, couldn't really illuminate, like more psychological dimensions. And that's how I got interested in the elements of value.
So is there like a specific thing you were working on, or was it sort of permeating over time? Or like, I would be curious of what were the first or initial, or the first time you actually thought of something, when you thought of one of the elements, probably at that point, it wasn't even called that.
It was, originally I used the term sources of value, but that didn't seem quite accurate. And so before I joined Bain, I had developed a starting list of what I call the sources of value. And that was triggered by conversations I'd had with clients who would say things like, I don't know where we're playing on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but I know we're not playing high enough. And so there were people who were thinking like, okay, we're providing a bunch of functional stuff to consumers, but we're not grabbing their attention. We're not generating loyalty because of emotions. I had one client who worked for a telco, who was struggling with the concept of value. He said, look, I think there is some theoretical distribution of value in the marketplace, but we're only achieving part of that theoretical maximum. And so help me think through how we could do that. And I think I failed at that mission, but it got me thinking about value in a new way. And I will say the other thing that I felt frustrated about is when was it, 2004, 2005, when I first started to work on this, I was tired of starting every project from scratch. In other words, we would do focus groups, we would do surveys, we do ethnographic interviews, and we sort of start from scratch. And I began to think, well, look, whatever is motivating these consumers, it's not infinitely complex. we, we know that there are certain types of things that people appreciate, they find beneficial. It's not infinitely complex. There's some level of measurement. There's some level, it's not three things, but it's not a billion things. It's something in between. And if we could develop a framework that helped us think about value at a not a microscopic altitude, but more of a 1,000-foot altitude, it could help us get to solutions quicker and more confidently. So that was the start. And I literally started to write things down on paper. And by 2014, I had, I think, 24 what I then called elements of value that I had identified that I knew were in play. Attractiveness is an obvious one. Attractiveness, by the way, is, there's design and aesthetics, which is about the product. But attractiveness, the way we define it, is, does the product make me look more attractive? And those rice cookers in Japan, the $1,200 ones, they made their owners look more attractive in the owner's mind. So they were beautiful. That's the design part. But the attractiveness is how it makes you feel. So, I began to think about, well, what is it that makes Disney so appealing? Well, part of it is nostalgia, because it makes you think about your own childhood and the Disney characters you knew. You're passing that on to your children. You're making memories with them. And I can show you some data on, or I'll tell you a story about Disney cruises in a minute. But so anyway, I started to think I had come up with 24 elements of value, and I presented those to our NPS loyalty forum. I don't know if you know that Bain developed the Net Promoter Score years ago.
No, I didn't know any of this, by the way, the Bain credited. But I really wanted to ask, because everybody in sales is using NPS. And I'm like, I'll ask you what, because you use it a lot in your conversations.
Well, literally thousands. It's probably tens of thousands of companies now use NPS. It's not something, we didn't invent the question. We invented the kind of analytical techniques to calculate the Net Promoter Score and to create a system to systematically use it. So, the power of NPS is its simplicity. It is probably the single, and I've done a lot of research on this, so trust me when I say that it's probably the single easiest question to ask to get at relative brand strength for brands, because it's just one question. And in our elements of value work, we correlate the elements of value in lots of different data, but one of the dependent variables is NPS. And basically, the more elements of value you deliver on, the higher your NPS. You do hit diminishing returns, and we just recently showed that in consumer products in a very comprehensive piece of work that we've done around the world. But NPS, let's see, I'm trying to remember now why I brought up NPS, but it was the NPS forum. And I showed that there were probably 100 people there. And I just gave a very brief presentation on the elements of the value. And people got very excited about it. There were a couple skeptics. People sort of saying, well, it's maybe we just can't simplify this, this much. Some people just like complexity and kind of, making up their own approaches. But we were encouraged enough so that I got a team the next year to help us do the first round of research. And that proved to be very important. I mean, a Bain case team is, I had a team for 4 months, and it was an awesome team. I lost the team 2 weeks before it was going to be complete, but then the case got canceled and they came back. And if I hadn't had that extra 2 weeks, it would have been much more challenging. But that led to our first article. By that time, we had identified 30 elements of value. Today, we're typically using 33. We've added some ESG elements of value, really in response to the marketplace, because ESG really wasn't talked about much in 2014, 2015, but it has become a very important topic. And really, they're kind of new elements of value. And we've been doing a lot of research on that. But anyway, that led to the first article in HBR, and that's probably the one that you read. And a couple things that I'll just say about the article. The week before it came out, I told my wife, I said, this is either going to be a really popular article or it's just going to be a big dud. And I cannot predict either way.
And I am so curious why you had doubt about.
Well, on the one hand, it as the editor at HBR said, it flew through the masthead. What that meant is the editors really they just thought it was great. And they didn't ask for endless revisions. And, it can take months to get an article in HBR. So it flew through the masthead. The editors really liked it. So that was good. But I wasn't sure how the marketing community was going to respond. And other than literally one cranky comment out of about 80 in on the hbr.org website, people just really responded well to it. It was like it was kind of in the air, and I just happened to be lucky enough to, put it down on paper. And we made a couple decisions that were important. One is, I called it the Elements of Value, a very simple title. It was just called the Elements of Value, the article. And the cadence that I used to come up with that title was The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Although, in fairness, he called it On the Origin of Species. But the Elements of Value was very clear. And I had a lot of friends at Bain who said, I think we need something more like the Elements of Consumer Value. And I said, no, it's just going to be the Elements of Value. We're just going to keep it simple. And the other was the pyramid. We made it, we looked at alternative frameworks. We looked at the periodic table. We looked at a bunch of different kind of constructs that we read in books by Edward Tufte and other, thinkers. But we settled on the Maslow pyramid because everybody kind of knew it. And the irony there is that Maslow didn't come up with the pyramid. Some professor at MIT did during the 70s or something. So, so everybody talks about the Maslow pyramid, but it's kind of a misnomer. All Maslow did was write prose. He didn't come up with any graphics. So that was kind of fun. But it really, if you just Google the Elements of Value, look at how many pyramids are out there that somehow take off on ours, or sometimes it issues ours, which is fine. It's in the public domain. But we got lucky on both of those counts. The simplicity of the concept and the graphic. I had one friend invited me to lunch. He's works with one of the design agencies, the design thinking agencies.
IDEO or Frog?
One of those, actually, one of those two. A great fellow, and he said, it was a very pleasant lunch. And he said, your article we use all the time. We use your pyramid all the time. He said, it's such a great article. But the only thing I can say is I'm really pissed off that you wrote that article and I didn't.
That's
Because,
fantastic.
when most people read it, it's like, well, this is kind of obvious. But it kind of congealed a lot of stuff that's in people's heads and gave it a tangible form. So we got lucky.
As we sort of launch into the value pyramid and we talk about the elements of value, firstly, I'm blown away that Maslow actually didn't create that. And you said, like you mentioned, it's a misnomer. And it's all that's associated with his name. At what point, actually, hold on, before I even go into all of that, just some quick background into, so I'm also from like an advertising, marketing sort of background. And I think one or the top three ways that the pyramid has been super helpful for me, and I don't know why not enough agencies use this, or anybody, let's say specifically in marketing. I don't know about the other, of course, we can go into some of the depths of in what context this is used. And I know that, I personally also use it in a sales context. And I actually got exposed to this pyramid for the first time within a consulting firm, and I still work with them. But what it helps you do is step out of your own skin and your own, my product, my thing, my whatever, and really build empathy for what the other person is feeling, what their experience is like, what they care about. And it's because it's not about you, it's about the outcomes of what they're trying to do and what problem. So this thing really just helps you get out of your own skin and start looking at the world from the other person's perspective, which is very hard to do sometimes because you're sort of just wrapped up in your own world. Yeah. So this thing is fantastic on that front, number one. And then number two, I think and this is going to be also parlay into my first question actually, is that when we are using this value pyramid in a sales context, for example, and I know that I've heard different talks of yours and read different articles where from a founder perspective, or when you're looking at existing product versus disrupting the market with thinking and using this. And I know you also talked about that appliance example. So, oh shit, 1 second. I just remembered something. I'm going into like inception mode and going into a completely separate tangent for just 2 seconds. Yeah. I wonder with that MP3 player, that's when Apple was really promoting the white cables. And I think it was that attractive that do you want to be seen walking around in New York with those cables? And that led to...
Yeah, I was almost going to say that, Paul. I've said that many times that it was walking advertising for them. You knew an Apple customer from their headphones.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, I love this. I love nerding out on this stuff too. Okay. So, and of course, I think the way that you've sort of described the pyramid is, and I'll go into the first context, and that's sort of where the first question also is that let's say when the pyramid is used in a sales context and you're trying to help an org with a massive transformation or business strategy, and you're looking at the buying and you're talking to the buyer. This could be a big bank or auto manufacturer, whoever that is. And so that pyramid really shines a light on when you're sort of looking at the org and you're like, okay, the executives are really about, I think you talked about like the purpose in one of the videos. But my question here is, how does the pyramid apply to the org versus the individuals, let's say in a sales context, when you're trying to close an RFP or a deal?
Let me spend a few minutes just describing first the B2C elements of value. I won't go into it too much, but as I said before, we started on the B2C side, and we actually we looked at products that were typically more engaging than consumer products. So we weren't doing elements of value work on CP products in the initial wave. We were looking at things that are more like phones, wireless services, cars, cruise lines, more immersive products, because frankly, those are more expensive, and they're more expensive because they deliver more value. So we were interested in, and it's basic economics, that the more value you deliver, whatever that value is, however you're measuring, the more you can deliver, the higher prices you can charge. And so in some ways, the elements of value, well, precisely, are about the experience of value and quantifying that value, looking at a set of competing brands. So in phones, in the initial wave, we looked at Apple, Samsung, and I can't remember the other brands that we looked at. We've looked at Pixel and others, etc. But the other thing to know about the elements of value is that the measurements are taken with people who have experience with the product. In other words, when we did the work on phones, we actually ask about Apple in the context of an iPhone or an iPad that somebody owned, and so you have to have experience with the product. It's not just image, okay? So in the first instance, the elements of value is about measuring the value that's delivered or not to a consumer. We determined a threshold, and we used a 0 to 10 scale, which is the same scale that's used in Net Promoter Score. We determined after lots of different analysis that the threshold would be 50% ratings of 8, 9, or 10 on that scale. So if 50% of your buyers gave you an 8, 9, or 10, we declare that you had delivered value to that consumer through your product or service. That threshold we've changed a little bit for different categories, like consumer products. We've lowered it a bit, and I'll come back to B2B in a second on that because there's an important finding there. But that was our threshold. So what do we find in the world? Most retail companies, you take Target or Walmart, Kohl's, they're delivering on 2 or 3 elements of value. Amazon is delivering on 8 elements of value pretty consistently since 2015. And the only retailer who has matched Amazon in our data set is Chewy, which is a dog food, pet food company that basically replicated the Amazon model. And what's interesting is that one of the few companies that's taken share from Amazon is Chewy in those categories. And they actually outperformed Amazon on 6 of the 8 elements of value that they're competing with Amazon on. So they're out. The elements of value basically shows why Chewy has been successful. And I should say, the fact that Amazon delivers on 8 elements of value, whereas Target and Walmart deliver on 2 or 3, that explains why Amazon has been taking share for 25 years now. So they are, I'm not even sure, personally, I'm not even sure I like Amazon, but they're just the best solution, for so many of the things I buy. They just make it so easy, right? So I wouldn't even say I'm loyal to Amazon. It's just that they provide more value in so many situations. Yeah. So
sorry, I had one question because you're on the topic before you jump into the B2B thing. I did see some a pyramid which said like B to B and then B to C. I don't know if that was created originally by Bain or it was like one of those, again, sort of, let's say,
No,
inspired versions of.
we first published the B2C work in Harvard Business Review, and then 2 years later we published the B2B elements of value. Because frankly, I gave a webinar at HBR. I think we had 3,000 people on the webinar. We got about 600 questions, and 2/3 of those questions were like, "How does this apply to B2B?" So the editor literally after that call said, "Well, Eric, that's your next article. There you go. Go off and write it." So I said, "Yes, sir." Um, anyway, yeah. So we developed the B2C pyramid, then and the measurement system, and then the B2B. We did that research in 2017, and I'll come back in a minute to why they're different and why it's important that they're different. One of the things we did in all of our waves of research is to try to correlate the elements of value performance of different brands with their market outcomes. And the dependent variables have varied depending on the category. The richest data we have is in consumer products because we can get that data from Nielsen and IRI, similar companies around the world. But what we found basically, as I said before, if you're delivering more elements of value than your competitors, you are typically growing faster. You have higher NPS ratings. If you're adding new elements of value over time, your NPS tends to be on the increase. And in consumer products, if you're outperforming on elements of value, you have faster growth rates, faster household penetration, and better repurchase patterns. So there is a clear tie to economic outperformance. That applies both in B2C and B2B. I'll talk about B2B in a second. But the Amazon taking share phenomenon, or even Chewy taking a share from Amazon phenomenon, it's all related to the value that they're delivering. And if you look at the cruise industry, I don't go on cruises, but I have done quite a bit of cruise work in my career. Disney Cruises outperforms everyone in that industry. And Disney delivers on 17 of the 30 elements of value.
Holy shit.
And they charge the highest prices in the industry. They've got the highest NPS, the highest kind of, repeat cruising. And people just love it, and we've had many situations with clients where we show them the Disney cruise data and they go, "Yep, that's me. I love them and my kids love them." And anyway, so anecdotally, it's all, validated just, in daily life. But so we, on the B2C side, we've done just tremendous. We've probably looked now at, I don't know, over 1,000 brands globally. We've done well over 1 million interviews. All of these patterns are confirmed. We've done a lot of work on insurgent brands and consumer products. They are outperforming because of the value they're delivering. So it's a way of measuring brand health, but it's also a way you can use the elements of value in a forward way, thinking about what kinds of value should we be working on. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but we use it in ideation sessions. We use it in design thinking work. And it's constantly, we just the other day presented an answer first on a new software value proposition where we said, we think these are the three categories of elements of value you should be delivering on here. And so it's really it's sort of a hypothesis generation method in advance of developing a new product for a company.
Because this would be the perfect thing that you would input into like a positioning exercise.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. And I don't know, I know a lot of agencies don't even know about this tool. Number one. Number two, even people who might be aware of this, is not knowing how to actually use this in a B2C context for positioning purposes and a B2B context.
Yeah. Let me turn to B2B for a moment. We realized that when we got into B2B, it was going to be more complicated. And the reason is, first of all, you hinted at this earlier, there are multiple decision makers, and they are motivated by different things. If I'm a purchasing agent, I am motivated to get the highest quality at the lowest price. And if I'm a CEO, I may be more interested in, topics of vision or purpose, what our company is going to be in the future. And so, there are lots of different dimensions just as a function of role in the business. However, these people are still people. And so they're going to have some basic expectations of customer service, of responsiveness, as to whether you are a kind of a partner or not. So it's more complicated. The other thing is the stakes are higher at B2B. When we did these first survey, which I'll describe in a few minutes, the thing we noticed right away is all the ratings were higher. We had a competitive set of companies, all in the IT infrastructure space. This was servers, storage servers, cloud, hybrid cloud, that sort of thing. All the ratings were higher than we experienced in B2C, in the B2C work. And we realized that what was happening is the expectations are higher in B2B. And therefore, the competitors, even the worst competitors, are doing reasonably well just to stay in business. So, and one of the reasons we believe is, why would expectations be higher at B2B? Well, your career is at stake. It's not just, if you buy a chocolate bar and it's not a good one, you might be out $3, but you're not going to lose your job, right? Or your wife is not going to divorce you. So the stakes are higher. If you're commissioning a large change management program, or you're with a consultant, or if you're buying a software package that's going to be mission critical, it's got to work because heads could roll if it doesn't, right? And so the stakes are higher. And so the competitive threshold is higher, and hence B2B players tend to get rated more highly in the value they deliver. There is also this issue, which you hinted at, it's kind of value to the organization versus value to people in the organization. Now, I happen to believe that all value to the organization gets transmitted to people. So we have to measure, there's no way we can measure the organizational, we can't get the organization's opinion. We have to talk to people. But, it's quite different if you are if you're measuring your vendor's responsiveness in returning a phone call versus improving the profitability of your unit. So, we actually have a more complicated pyramid. We came up with 36 elements of value, which range in from sort of table stakes to to the kind of level of purpose of the company and everything in between. So the largest area of the B2B pyramid is what we call ease of doing business. And that's an important one because it really has to do with responsiveness, being a partner, having strong relationships with people, and those sorts of things. But what's interesting is there's now there are types of value that really have to do with people's careers. So if you look at the Salesforce Dreamforce meeting that before COVID was in San Francisco, right? They would invite 300,000 people or whatever it was to San Francisco. They actually brought cruise lines in because the hotel capacity was not big enough. And but what was that conference all about? It was about training, certification, entertainment. I mean, there were big rock concerts. There was networking, and training, certification, networking. Those are all about your career. And I think Salesforce has been a standout in delivering, not just being easy to do business with. For example, they don't charge nonprofits the way they charge corporate clients. And so I think in some nonprofits, they actually give it away for free. But they're also really paying attention to people's careers. And it's so important to do that. I mean, Bain has been doing that for years. We have partners who literally started to build relationships with very junior people in companies years ago, and now those people get promoted. And we map our consultants to client team members, and they often form lifelong friendships, and that pays off in the long run. So it's really being concerned about people's careers and helping them get ahead and so forth. Anyway, to go back to the research we did on the B2B side, we found very similar patterns in business outcomes. The more elements of value deliver on, faster the growth rates, and the more likely you are to have repurchase of your products in the future. We also we looked at, and this is really interesting to me. So in this space, the IT infrastructure space, we looked at the server providers, companies like IBM and Dell, Cisco, and so forth. We also looked at the cloud players, people like Microsoft Azure and AWS. What was interesting is the year we did that work, the AWS ratings might have been a little lower because they had an outage, an 18-hour outage on the East Coast a few months before. And that's a serious thing if you're a cloud player. But the standout performer was Microsoft Azure. And this really surprised us at the time because we thought AWS would be the standout. But it turns out that Azure is much more of a custom solution provider. They really work with your IT teams to customize the software to make it work better for you. Bain is a Microsoft shop. Our IT people love what Microsoft provides and so forth. Anyway, we noted this that Azure was shooting the lights out on like 17 of the elements of value or something, and the other players were just, some of them were way back. And what is interesting is at the end of 2017, Azure had taken share in the cloud market, and it has continued to take share all the way up to today. So once again, the elements of value seem to be predictive not only of current success, but of future success. Going back to the Apple example or the Amazon example. So, that's the same phenomena we discovered on the B2C side are playing out on the B2B side as well. Having said all that, we have a couple clients that are using the elements of value in a really novel way to me, which is they're not so concerned about using it as a measuring tool, because it's expensive to do B2B research, to find the right people. It's a headache. I'll just tell you that. It's much easier on the B2C side. But what they are doing is with their customer success programs, they are sitting down with salespeople and looking at the pyramid and saying, okay, we have a meeting with Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones next week. What do we think motivates them? What do we think the kind of value that they want to experience is? And they have a brainstorming session really aimed at that individual to say, what do we need to deliver to them? And how do we do that? What are the things we say? What are the things we need to demonstrate? And frankly, Bain has always done this in one way or another. And we just find the elements of value is a good way to trigger those discussions and to get specific about it.
The last thing that you brought up, and I was actually thinking about this, but the pyramid or this tool, whether that's in a B2B context or a B2C context, but specifically, for the sake of right now, if we focus more on the B2B side, is that it's less about the measurement, but it's more about having more higher resolution conversations and helping people have empathy for the buyer on the other end. Now, so now there's as you were sort of describing some of those situations and context, 4 things came to my mind. One, early on, you were talking about, the incentive of the buyer. So whether that's, an executive who's maybe got some equity advantage bonus partner versus somebody who was maybe, the delivery person. So those people have different incentives. And I'm not exactly sure or incentive is a composition of a different elements, or it's just one. Or I'm not exactly sure. Maybe you could have some thoughts on how do you connect that incentive for that individual to the pyramid? And I think you brought up a really important point, which I was really curious about, which you brought it in a B2C context, but I was thinking, how would that apply in a B2B context? Is over time, you begin adding elements of value. Now, let's say in a buying cycle, at the onset, you're using it to have meaningful conversation. But once you start delivering the work, what elements of value do you begin to add? And then how would you look at a CXO versus a delivery person or CEO, and or how is this tool used over time with different folks, and how those different elements of value are added over time? I think.
Yeah.
And then finally, sorry, I've given you a whole bunch of stuff.
It's okay.
Pick away at whatever you fancy first. And then finally, I think I would still be curious, even if it's not, because I think you did say, I'll be honest, it's complicated. Is what's the baseline, or how do you do the benchmarking on some of these elements? If Because you would want to, I'm guessing people would want to know like a before versus after.
Maybe I'll start with that. I mean, we have had a number of clients who have used the B2B elements of value with their customer success organizations to include it in their surveys um, that they do once a year with their customers. And so, if you're diligent about doing that, you can develop a track record over time. I think I'm less enthusiastic about that than I am the having the companies literally sitting down with the elements of value, thinking about different buyers, and asking themselves, what do they value and how do we deliver on it? And so, you do see some of this occurring naturally. So, for example, the B2B sellers who call on purchasing agents, let's say somebody who buys commodity wheat, for example, or iron, or whatever it might be, that salesperson can probably be a different type of character than a consultant or an IT person who is calling on a CIO or a CEO. A CEO really doesn't want to talk to a commodity wheat salesman because, I mean, obviously I'm exaggerating. And I'm sure the wheat salesman is a nice person, but they're not going to be able to sort of carry on a conversation that a CEO wants, right?
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
that's even true for a company like Bain. You know, you need to be careful who's talking to the CEO, right? And we guard those relationships very, very carefully. I know that's obviously that's an exaggeration, but it shows the point that the CEO is going to expect a certain level of value from a conversation with a B2B seller. And it's going to be of a very different type than a purchasing agent. The purchasing agent is going to be interested in obviously price and quality, but by the way, they might also be interested in risk reduction. They might be interested in stability of supply. They might be interested in the fact that you, the salesman, are going to take seriously any problems that they have and solve them. So even the most kind of commoditized transactions often have dimensions of value that are going to be important and you need to think about, and you need to think about how you deliver that. You need to think about how you get the credit for that. And, you might have to be on the phone with that person after hours or on the weekend. And, it just comes with the territory. So the point is, Paul, using the elements of value is a really good tool to think about all of the complex sort of human dimensions behind these B2B interactions and relationships. And, some survey work is going to be helpful. We do surveys at Bain. We get feedback on our consultants, on our partners, on our teams. And some of that feedback is hard to hear. Like we tend to like to deliver a lot of complex analysis and slides, and oftentimes our clients don't like that too much. But so we've worked hard to improve our communications. But these B2B relationships are as complex as almost any kind of human relationship, right? And that's something that, Apple as a product manufacturer doesn't have to deal with too much, right? You don't have a relationship typically with an employee of Apple.
Correct.
But you sure do with a consulting firm or a law firm, and that's another reason why B2B is so tricky, and another reason why they have to perform at a higher level to thrive and survive. And what I think is interesting about Azure is that I think Azure provides more human interaction than some of its competitors, precisely because they realize it can be an advantage to have them on your side. So, anyway, I don't invest in Microsoft stock, so I'm not. I'm just talking about our research and and the surprising finding that they did so well,
Right.
and are being rewarded for it.
So the tool is really more about the interactions, the relationships, having higher resolution conversations, and lesser about measurement. And if you are interested in measurement, then you can always do surveys. And if you're diligent with that, then you can have sort of like a map of sort of before versus after sentiment of the client. And I think there's a huge element of also like, I have to impress my boss. So look how much money I saved, unless it's like a hardcore procurement sort of purchase. Even though it's almost like I hear this joke a lot. It's like at work, I mean, in the B2B context, people are like, but it's a B2B. It's like they're still people. When they leave the office, they still have to go buy groceries, take care of their family. They're still people. They still have emotions. So even if it's a hardcore procurement decision, there's still people involved.
Yeah.
So now, if I was to sort of take this conversation that we've been having and start to hit descent and head towards the airport, what I would wanted to do was, and this is something that happens all the time with all different kinds of philosophies, tools, frameworks, is that the creator of them comes with a certain intention of why they created that thing and how it could be used. And then people often muck it up. So now, having said that, what are some of the most common mistakes or bad interpretations of this that you have seen over time? And what would be your counter to those, if any?
Yeah, I think the most common mistake with the elements of value is that people talk about the elements of value as being the values of people. And and this may be a problem with the term value, but look, people do have values. But the value we're measuring here, the value we're talking about, is the value that's delivered through a product or service or combination of the two. It's not so much, it is about what people value in that experience, but it's not their values. Their values, that's a different thing. And so that's something that I listen for to make sure people understand what we're talking about. And that's why I've been talking about the experience of value more and more over time. I never use the term values. I talk about the elements of value and the experience of value. So that's number one. The other, I think, is a tendency for everyone to look at the elements of value and say, okay, what are we missing here for our business? And sometimes things are missing. We added 3 ESG elements of value over the last 7 years because it's really emerged in the marketplace, and people are beginning to look at the ESG reputation of companies and evaluate. So those are kind of new. They were, maybe we missed something in the first go around. I'm not saying everything's perfect, but I think that you want to avoid changing the elements of value to make them too specific to your product or service. And the reason we do that is you want to have some sense of how the value you're delivering compares to other categories. Because, next year I can buy a car, or I can buy a phone, or I can buy an expensive camera. And so, the phone category is actually, and this is especially true in the developing world. In India, people do have to make a choice of, do I buy a two-wheeler next year, or do I buy a phone, or can I afford both? There are a lot more people there who have to make that trade-off. And so, understanding how your category compares to others is an important angle of the elements of value. And we developed it at an altitude where you need to be careful not to make the elements of value too specific to your own business, because categories compete with each other. And I guess the final thing I'll say is, it pays to have some consistency in measurement over time, because, and some of these surveys are changed year after year. You don't really know what's moving and what's not. So that's been one nice thing about the elements of value. We can see that Vanguard, which is a investment firm, they've actually improved their elements of value over time. We helped them add advice to their business back in 2015. We did work that led up to that, and it shows in their numbers. They had way too many customers who were coming in through 401ks, et cetera, who had not bought into the Vanguard philosophy, and they really needed advice. Some consistency of measurement over time is a good thing.
Fantastic. I just remembered that I forgot the name of the creator of the Vanguard. There's a book called The Little Book on Investing or something.
John Bogle?
Yes.
John Bogle.
I was reading that book about 6 months ago. Somebody recommended it to me. And he talks about like investing and putting money. Anyways, I just remember that.
It's so funny you mentioned him, because I did some pro bono work in Philadelphia for an organization that he was on the board of. And I did a telephone interview with him. And he was just the nicest man. I was pretty nervous because he's like a big deal. But he was just the nicest person. Amazing.
Right.
What an impact he's had.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that book is also, by the way, fantastic. And so great anecdote and story there. Okay. And so as we sort of close off, okay, hold on. Before I even do any close off or summarize or conclude, I think today's conversation was really fantastic. I learned a lot, got into different perspectives and how to think about certain things. I think that's what kind of drives my curiosity of doing these podcasts, is more about not what you're thinking, but how you're thinking about things and how you see the world and the lens that you look at. So that's really helpful and sort of helps me improve the way I look at the world and improves my resolution of understanding as well. And so we covered a whole bunch of topics, and I'll put a whole bunch of stuff that Eric and I talked about, including the elements of value, all the links to the HBR articles in the show notes. So for the people listening, so they're all going to be there. All the links. I'll link also some of the YouTube videos in which Eric talks about some of these different case studies, which are also super helpful to build additional context. And then finally, sorry, I had one more thing, which was. Oh, right. Sorry. Just remembered. And finally, where I would want to end this conversation would be on sort of two questions. And one, because when you look at an expert, when you look at, and this is something that you said sort of earlier in the conversation, you're like, one of your friends, he's like, I wish I had written this article because it seems so obvious. But it's like when you look at an expert, whether that's a skateboarder or somebody playing tennis, whatever that activity is, or they're playing a piano, and you're like, oh, I could play this. And the amount of work that goes into getting to that simplicity, to making it so approachable. So now, having said that, with your expertise, so whenever you sort of look at this framework or tool as an expert, what are some of the hacks of how you sort of read it and how do you approach it? Where do you start, or what do you prioritize in your experience? That's one. And then finally, what any final thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with, and then we can sort of wrap up from there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think about your question this way. What are the key lessons here? Well, lesson number one is think about the value you're delivering, and think about it a lot. Companies probably tend to worry more about the prices they're charging than the value they're delivering. And I think that's wrong because that can take you into the commodity trap. What lessons have we learned? Well, basically, the more value you can deliver with some diminishing returns, the better, because it will allow you to grow. It'll allow you to take share. It'll allow you to maybe even reduce cost. I mean, think about how little Apple advertises, because they, all their advertising comes through their customers for free. So there is goodness in delivering value. And I will also say that it's not just in exchange for money from customers, but also their time and attention, and maybe even their information. So value can be exchanged for many things. It's not infinitely complex. It can be thought about in a handful of types of value. They may change over time, but by and large, they're pretty stable. Many of them go back in history a long way. And anyway, those are some of the key lessons. And I guess I would ask everyone who is in business to think about the question, on Monday morning, what should I be doing to think about more value that I can deliver to customers? And, what would that value be if we were going to try to do that?
This could probably be really stupid, but, sometimes people think that, giving more value is, let's just give them the cheapest. And that is so...
Yeah, generally that's not a good strategy. Exactly. Because that takes you down. That takes you down the price curve.
Yeah.
And once you get down the price curve, it's really hard to climb back up.
Yeah. I think you illustrated a whole bunch of great examples from the Disney cruises. Obviously, we also talked about Apple. We also talked about, we also brought up Dyson, which is also a great example. Then we also talked about Bermuda. I think that was the name of the cookers.
Yeah, the rice cookers. The two rice cookers are Vermicular. That's VER, Vermicular.
Yeah,
and
I'm going to put
Bermuda. Look at Vermicular on Amazon. The prices have come down for the U.S. I don't know what they're charging in Japan, but they're still $600 or $700 for a rice cooker.
So for the audience listening, if there's one thing that we would recommend is I'll put my affiliate Amazon link in the show notes. So just kidding. Just kidding. Of those cookers. Fantastic. This
Another really good example, by the way, is Leica.
you did bring up that in one of your yes.
Leica is charging basically $7,000 for their latest digital camera without a lens.
Just the body.
The body. So the lens will set you back another $4,000. But the reason is, it's like Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson charges, the Japanese knockoffs are probably better bikes, but they're not a Harley Davidson. And so you have to pay more, you have to wait longer to get it. And it's just amazing. But it has to do with self-actualization. If you're a serious photographer, you probably want to have a Leica, even though Canon would probably do just fine. It's not a Leica.
I'm curious, and this is probably my last question. Do you happen to own a couple of those?
I do, but
I don't feel it.
The ones that I own are old film cameras.
So do you still do you have film?
I don't use film anymore. So, okay. But I still have the cameras because they're Leicas.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Because just quick story. My dad is still a journalist. He's still practicing. So I, as a kid, would go, to the newspaper head office where the printing used to happen. And my dad would send me with the photographers in the developing room. And I got exposure to a whole bunch of different cameras very early on. So I've had my own sort of intimate relationship with cameras from a very young age.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always liked optics. As a kid, I was kind of into science, built telescopes and stuff like that. And I now notice on my Instagram feed that I get a lot of Leicas appearing on my feed, probably because I click on them, right? It's people who are into cameras are often really into cameras, and there's still people using film. It's making a comeback, just like vinyl, right? I love. Speaking of the elements of value, there was a great cartoon in the New Yorker showing this guy standing in front of his vinyl setup, his turntable, his stack of records. He said, the thing that really drew me to it, the things that really drew me to the vinyl were the inconvenience and the expense. I just love that. Yeah. The thing that drew me to film is all the bad chemicals and the inconvenience of it.
Love it. Oh, this was super fun.
Maybe that's a new concept. It's kind of an inverse element of value. You like the pain and suffering, so you go for it, right? All those hisses and pops on the vinyl records, you love it, right? So, anyway.
Right. This was super fun. I really enjoyed this conversation.
This has been great. I really appreciate your reaching out. And I must say, this is a lot more fun without the slides. This really taught me something. So thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Well, by sheer accident. And
check out the Vermicular rice cookers. It's pretty crazy.
Oh, I'm all over it. I'm gonna be all over. I love expensive things. That's my biggest problem.
Good.
Anyways, thank you so much. And
nice to see you, Paul.